This is the Money Radio Network. It's time for Health Futures with Cypress HomeCare Solutions, Bob Roth. This is Arizona's only show dedicated to providing you with expert advice on how to live a longer, healthier, and happier life. To learn more, call 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Bob Roth.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. And it must be Friday, and indeed it is. We're coming at you live from the Scottsdale Air Park. It is Friday, August 23rd. And if you're just tuning in, Health Futures is a show about how our older adult population can live a healthier, happier life. And I've been privileged to bring this show here to our audience now for 6 years. And, each time we have a show, we learn something new. And why do we learn something new? We bring extraordinary guests to the show. And it's really about the guests that come to our show, and they deliver the content that our listeners can walk away with some really valuable nuggets, some good information about healthcare, about aging, stuff that they may not have known before. So today is no different. I have two extraordinary guests here on the show. They're in the same vertical, same space I'm in, and it's not the first time I've had other home care partners here in the studio with me, but it really, truly takes a village to be able to care for our elderly, and I'm really proud to have these two guests here in the studio with me. I've got Gavin Ward and Zac Morgan. They are both from 24-Hour Home Care, and they both are regional directors of strategy and partnership. Welcome to the show, boys.
Thanks so much for having us.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having us. Yeah, definitely.
It's good to have you guys. And, I've been watching 24-Hour Home Care now for almost about 10 years since you guys came onto the front. And you guys are doing things unique and different. And, I would love for you, either Zac or Gavin, talk us through a little bit about the 24-hour home care model, the strategy. You guys have multiple locations. You are doing things, and they're all for the better, and they're enabling older adults to be able to stay at home because, let's face it, 9 out of 10 want to do just that. So I'll punt it over using a football metaphor. Send it over to you, Gavin.
Sounds great. Well, you mentioned football. It is preseason for the NFL and coming up to college season, so probably the appropriate time to use that. I'm actually a big soccer fan, so when I think of football, I think of the different type.
There you go.
A little briefly about 24-hour home care, and for the listeners that may be familiar with home care or aren't familiar with home care, hopefully this story can resonate with you. So the founders of our company were three young guys in their 20s who started thinking of forming a home care company in 2007 is when they kind of thought of the idea. And in 2008 is when the business actually started. Now, your listeners may recall what was happening in 2008 was the recession.
Recession.
So these gentlemen, their names are David Allerby, Ryan Iwamoto, and Tyner Slay, actually met with a small business consultant who said, don't do it. Don't start a home care business. It's a recession. It's a bad time. But these guys were pretty determined, and with just very little friends and family funding, they got off the ground. And that was 2008 in Southern California, in a place called Torrance, California, which is also known as the South Bay of Southern California. And today, they have built the organization to 17 locations, including here in Arizona, California, and Texas. And it's been pretty neat to be a part of that journey. I know, Zac, you were one of the very first employees.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey being in a company as it grows up. You mentioned that it does take a village. I mean, there are plenty of home care companies out there, but you probably have the same unique experience that we got of starting something when it was very bootstrap. Everybody wore every hat and getting to see it kind of grow up from there. So it's been an exciting journey to be on.
It is. And like you said, wearing every hat, I mean, really to best understand this business is to really understand the care that is being delivered by the caregivers that are actually making differences in people's lives every single day. And the three gentlemen that you were talking about, they were all healthcare staffing veterans, and if I remember correctly, they were from Maxim, right?
Yeah, that's correct. They were fortunate to kind of be able to work for a company right out of college
Right.
in the healthcare space. I had the opportunity to actually work in the same office, coincidentally, as those three guys. Maybe there's not a coincidence that we're still working together. But, yeah, that's where they got their background. One of our very first clients was actually one of their family members.
Nice.
Tyner has a really cool story where he actually is, it's kind of the story you might hear in other entities where, he was a caregiver. And so that's been really neat. And a little bit about just our model, and I'm sure you've talked about this on your show. So these gentlemen did it right. They're, employing their caregivers. They are, providing medical benefits to the staff, trying to treat them right. And it's a full-service home care agency, and it's pretty neat. Bob, I've heard a previous episode of your show where home care really is getting on the radar of health plans, hospital systems. It's no longer, you may have used this term, but the redheaded stepchild of healthcare.
Right.
And it's been neat. Zach and I have had the opportunity to kind of grow up in home care with 24-hour and start to be part of those conversations. I know you have as well, and it's been neat.
Well, what's interesting is the company that Steve Bisciotti built, and he's with Aerotech and Maxim being part of it. I know so many people that got their start there and launched very successful companies. So I'm not surprised that 24-hour home care got born out of that experience, if you would.
Definitely. One thing I just can take away from my experience there was just the work ethic. It was definitely kind of an old school work ethic back then in my early days. But yeah, we were lucky enough to learn the ropes, and I'd say even sometimes right place, right time. We actually started that company's very first home care office at a young age. So
nice.
It was I was 23 going in to meet with families who needed care for their loved ones, and I would wear this suit. And to be upfront, knew very little about what I was doing at the time. But yeah, I would go in there sweating because it was pretty embarrassing. I failed. I call fail forward. And, today I'm...
It's the only way you learn, right?
Yeah. So it's been neat, and, we've done things a little bit differently, and, yeah, here we are today.
Well, what's interesting is, you talk about this space, and, we talked about it just before the show started. I mean, we're kind of in the pre-adolescent stage in home care. It's a really, really new trade, and I always give props to Paul and Lori Hogan, who started Home Instead, and that was back in 1992, and kind of legitimized this space, because prior to that, it was just a whole bunch of independents that were ma and pa shops, and the need, as you know, wasn't as great as it is today, and it's not today. It pales in comparison to what it's going to be like tomorrow, because the need's going to only continue to grow, and as a result, we have learned along the way some amazing things, and someone gave us this great moniker referring to our industry as non-medical or non-skilled or non-clinical, and I've been on this crusade to really define who we are, because that defines who we're not. It tells us that we're not medical, but we truly are. I mean, if you think about it, if we're not keeping people fed, clean, cared for, safe, and in compliance with their discharge orders, making sure they take their medications at the right time, it is medical, because they're not going to live. They'll probably die.
Yeah.
So, in-home care, in-home personal care is more descriptive of what we do. And, I love the name that your founders came up with, 24-hour home care, because a lot of people need care around the clock. And the challenges that we run into every day is really defining who we are. And, I think this is a good time to really talk about, are we home care or are we home health? And a lot of people think we're one and the same, and we're so different. And I can take our listeners through this. I mean, home health is more, first of all, it means you have to be bedbound. Typically, you get discharged from an acute or post-acute provider, acute being a hospital, post-acute meaning a rehab or a skilled nursing facility. And, you are usually being seen by a nurse, usually being seen by a therapist. It could be a certified nursing assistant, but it's an episodic visit. It's usually for an hour. Yeah. Could be 45 minutes, could be an hour, 15 minutes. But We, meaning home care agencies, we're usually there 4, 8, 12, or 24. And if our shift is supposed to start at 8 o'clock, our caregivers better be there at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
You know, I use the old Vince Lombardi line, and that is, if you're not 10 minutes early, you're 20 minutes late. So, you know, our caregivers know that they need to be there on time. You know, it's hard to believe we're down one segment. I want to learn a little bit more about you guys and what you're doing. Got a little boss taking us out of the first segment, and I will just give a shout-out because I'm a really big Bruce Springsteen fan, and if you've not gone out and seen the movie Blinded by the Light, you should go see it because tunes like this and many others are playing in it, and it just brings back lots of great memories, and this guy is a genius when it comes to music. You've been listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. I got Gavin Ward. I've got Zac Morgan. Both of them are from 24-hour home care. We're up against a break. We got one down. We got 3 more to go, gentlemen. Stick around. We'll be right back.
As we take our stand down in jungle.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. And if you're just tuning in, we're on our second segment. And I've got 2 gentlemen here from the home care space. They're from 24-hour home care. I got Gavin Ward and Zac Morgan. And we're here talking about home care. If you missed the first segment, we talked a little bit about 24-hour home care's background and how they got started. They've been around for just a little bit more than 10 years. Survived through the recession, getting it up and started. And they're doing some great things in 17 different markets, 17 different locations, and growing every single day. And I like what you guys are doing, and I'm very much admiring, you know, the impact that you guys are having on our industry, and it's really important to get some more sophisticated players out there, and I think you guys really add that to the mix, if you will. You know, in terms of professionalizing what we do, because our industry's been known to be just a mom and pop type industry, and you know, I talked really quickly in the first segment talking about Paul and Lori Hogan in 1992, but there's been a lot of sophistication since then, and that is, you know, you guys coming aboard, and Gavin, you and I have talked about my partnership with the Honor Care Network, you know, Honor being involved, and others, where we're really reshaping the way care is being delivered. So before we start talking a little bit more about home care, I'd like to learn a little bit more about both of you gentlemen. So, Gavin, I'm looking over you. I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier in the first segment that you were with Maxim and you sat side by side with some of these founders, but that wasn't really your beginning. Tell me, or maybe it was.
Yeah, no, it actually was. It was the beginning. I was very fortunate right out of college. I actually interned. So we're at a radio station today. I actually interned for American Broadcasting Company in my senior year in college, wanting to be a sports center broadcaster.
Nice.
I went to school up in Santa Barbara, California, and actually hated my internship. ABC is a great company, but waking up at 4 in the morning and not having much to do, and it was actually my interview for my ABC internship was on September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
And I think we all know, we all remember that day. So, yeah, long story short, didn't do that. Was fortunate. Maxim actually hires a lot of young folks right out of college to teach them the ropes. And I kind of fell into it. And ever since then, been very fortunate to be in healthcare. I am married, my lovely wife, Tina. We just had our 10-year wedding anniversary. Went to Hawaii last week, and
big shout out to Tina.
Yes,
all right, congratulations.
She's a teacher. Today is her second day with kids. For all you teachers out there, or folks who know teachers, back in it today. So show them a lot of love. Got 2 great kids, Owen and Alicia, 8 and 6, and they're going back to school next week. So yeah, that's just a little background about me. Been in home care now almost 15 years, and I've been very fortunate to be positioned and given the opportunity at 24-hour home care to actually lead a lot of conversations with some of these health plans, government organizations as well, that are starting to actually realize what we do and to actually fund what we do, including some Medicare dollars for the first time. So that's a little bit about my background.
Zach, how about you?
Yeah, my path was a little bit different. I graduated from LMU. We talked about the recession. I graduated in kind of the pits of that recession, and there wasn't a whole lot to do. I loved my college experience, but I think my one regret was that I hadn't studied abroad. So an opportunity came up to go teach English and science and math in South Korea. So I went and did that for a year, traveled around Asia and Southeast Asia. And as I was coming back, I really didn't want to move back home. And so I was, searching the job market, and this job was posted. I didn't know anything about senior care. I studied sports medicine and business in college. So I sent in my resume from an internet cafe in Thailand.
Wow.
On my last trip, on my last little vacation while I was over there. And when I came back, I had my phone interview that first week. I always joke with the owners of our company. I was a terrible interview. I mean, if I interviewed myself now, I probably wouldn't have hired me, but luckily they needed warm bodies and they saw something I didn't. But it ended up being a real blessing in disguise because I got opportunities here because it was such a startup feel. I got opportunities that I never would have been afforded at, a big kind of conglomerate company. And, my friends all made fun of me when I first started, old people, really, that's the industry that you're going into. But, here almost 10 years later, nobody really makes that comment or asks that question anymore. It's definitely become more legitimate and at front of the conversation, just in broad strokes now.
Zach's being super humble. The interview process was not so easy, and he's being super humble.
I still was probably a terrible interview. So,
well, hey, listen, you're here.
That's right.
That's all that matters.
That is right.
And HomeCare, you're in a great space. I mean, I think the biggest challenge that we run into, especially with HomeCare, is because it's still somewhat of an unsophisticated business. So many people and markets like Arizona, where there's no licensure, can open up a shop and they could literally get out of prison today and then Monday open up a shop. And that makes it really hard. I mean, you got to, and I'm appealing to our listening audience, really understand who you're engaging. Yeah. Because let's face it, when a care recipient opens up the door to their home, they open their life to a caregiver. And you want to make sure that everybody is vetted out, their background checked, and you have the proper insurances in place.
Right.
And it kills me to see people be penny wise yet pound foolish. And engaging an agency like Cypress HomeCare or 24-Hour Home Care, that you've got a company that's standing behind it.
Yeah, and we get the impression, especially Gavin and I, can skew that way a little bit because we are on the innovation and the business focused side of it. Sometimes people can forget that where our passion has to lie is in the care part. My late grandmother was diagnosed with a really aggressive brain tumor towards the end of her life, and she had to move in with my mother. And so I watched for a year, and this is well before I started at 24-Hour. I watched over the course of almost a year, not only my grandmother's health and well-being decline, but also my mother's health and well-being decline. She had a full-time job, and then she had a full-time job taking care of her mother at home. And it got to a point where we had to find other options. And so I always try to remind people that even though we are coming in and talking about things and we understand that it's a financial burden, but we also are acutely aware of what it can mean to families and to individuals. And that is at the center of what we try to do. So people can get caught up in the business side, but it really does boil down to where do you want to age? How do you want to age? Your family's well-being, your well-being in the end.
I want to just say this. Your mom is one of those unsung heroes. And, we don't talk enough about family caregivers and what they're doing. They estimate there's a number between 40 and 50 million Americans that are really making sacrifices every day to care for their loved ones. And, we don't do enough as a society, a country, a community to help them. And, one of the things that, we are on a crusade at HCOA, Home Care Association of America, is to try to get some legislation in place to help those family members out. One, AARP has a bill that is still in Washington that's called the Credit for Caring Act, and it'll give families a $3,000 tax credit at the end of the year, provisioning our services or pharmaceutical products or medical equipment. And then the other one is we're passionately about HSAs, health savings accounts. They're not allowed to be used to pay for caregiving right now, and we're appealing to them to get that done. I want to talk a little bit more about those family home care givers when we come on back. It's hard to believe we're down 2 segments. We're at halftime here at Health Futures. Stick around. I've got 24-hour home care in the studio. Both Gavin Ward and Zac Morgan will be back. You got it.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. We're in our second half. If you missed the first half, you missed a great first half. So I want you to go up to our website at cypresshomecare.com. The media button up on the top, click on that. Third button down's radio show. You'll be able to catch this show here today, and you'll be able to catch about 300 others that we've been bringing to you for the last 6 years. So if you're just tuning in, I got 24-hour home care here in the studio. I got both Zac Morgan and Gavin Ward, and both are regional directors in strategy and partnership. And we've been talking about home care. And interesting enough, we've been talking about just how the need continues to grow. And, when we left off in the second half, Zac was talking about his mom being that family caregiver. And, we really don't do enough for family caregivers. And I was talking about some of the bills that we have in D.C. we're trying to put through. I mentioned Home Instead earlier, Paul and Lori Hogan. Home Instead's the one that sponsored the HSA bill. And we're supporting that. We all should be supporting that to get the Congress folks to be able to sign that on and give the people in our community access to their HSA funds to be able to pay for caregiving.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Bob, do you know if that would also include flexible spending accounts, or is that specifically for health savings accounts?
Right now, it's specifically for HSAs.
Okay.
But doesn't mean it couldn't cross over. And I think if we get that milestone or we achieve that landmark milestone, we'll be able to maybe bring in flexible spending as well. But interesting enough, one of the biggest challenges we have is these family caregivers, right? So let's say the number's 40 million. Let's say hypothetically 5% of those folks, 5%, so 2 million have the wealth and the means to come home and care for a loved one. What do we do with the other 35 million people?
Yeah.
36 million people. How do we do this?
Yeah.
And we're really not quite prepared for it. But we talked about home care, and there are agencies like 24-hour home care and Cypress who do it the right way. But then there are others that don't. And more specifically, I'd love to just make sure people understand the difference between a private caregiver, a 1099 caregiver, which is a contractor, or someone that comes through a registry. And these registries sometimes look and feel a lot like a home care company like Cypress or 24-hour home care, but when you really peel back the onion and you ask them about their employees, they're not employees, they're contractors. And why do we really walk through this? We walk through this so we can help people understand that there's not really training that's involved. There's no care oversight that is being provided. There's no insurances. And I'm not just talking about professional liability insurance, but I'm also talking about workers' comp.
Yeah.
And many people think that their homeowner's insurance is going to pay for it. But let me just tell you something. You put skin, soap, and water together in a bathroom, that's a recipe for disaster. And I guarantee you, if a private caregiver falls in that bathroom and hurts themselves, your homeowner's insurance is not going to cover it. So all of those things are covered by a home care agency that's an employer-based agency. And I know that I've got partners across from me here that advocate that, and we really need to continue to be up on that soapbox and really help educate consumers the difference between a home care agency and one that is employing contractors, or should I say engaging contractors. They wouldn't be employing them.
Yeah, it is interesting. We touched a little bit earlier, I think off air. In California in 2016, we went through admittedly an arduous process of licensure, but really it was a really important step for home care in California. And part of that went down to the fact that registries cannot be licensed in California. So if you are wanting to work with an agency that is doing background checks and is doing training and has the proper insurances, you can actually check now if that agency is a licensed home care organization in California. But as you touched on, in most other states, here in Arizona, even out in Texas, those same regulations aren't in place. And, even as licensed home care agencies, the reasons that we have things like insurance, workers' compensation insurance, liability and bonding, we have a hiring process in place that finds us the best caregivers, but there's a reason that we have those insurances. Even we are not always perfect, but you hear the horror stories, unfortunately, far too often of people who did go down that private hire road without fully understanding what they were taking on, whether it was through a registry and they thought the registry was providing those things because it wasn't made clear up front, or whether they hired somebody from the neighborhood or from just a family connection. And those things range. Sometimes that can be the right option for people. They might find a great caregiver, they might have a relationship with them, that can work for some people, but unfortunately far too often you hear the other end of that spectrum, from theft to inadequate care to being taken advantage of. And, even in Texas, and I apologize, this is a little bit morbid, but there was actually just recently an arrest of someone that they now have deemed a serial killer who was posing as a licensed nurse, going in and providing private care inside residential senior living communities, and killing the people that he was caring for and stealing from them. And it's a horrifying story. And, you mentioned that we advocate for people to know what they're getting into beforehand. We obviously recommend going with a licensed agency, or with even like with Cypress, an agency that does it right. But when you hear those stories, it just really pulls everything back to just how important that is. People sometimes can't see past the dollar signs, but it really does have an impact.
And at the end of the day, when you do the math, it really isn't quite the savings people think it is. And, we've done a great job here. We formed a group called the Safe Home Care Coalition. I know you guys are familiar with that, and really help spell out the difference between using a registry contractors versus using an employer-based agency. The one piece that people lose sight of, and Home Care Association of America has a white paper on it up on their website, and that's hcaoa.org, being the accidental employer.
Yes.
And we had a case in Illinois where this family employed or engaged this contractor for about 7 years and paid this contractor a lot of money. Well, the contractor, I guess, wasn't too bright. Let's put it that way, because they went down to file for unemployment, and that just opened up the case. And guess what? The family was responsible for the taxes, and it was big money, big numbers. And, the penalties are just tremendous, and it's just not really worth it. Not so much the penalties there, but the risk that you're putting your loved one in. Yeah. So we need to continue to educate. We need to be able to really raise the bar of the work we do and the professionalism that our caregivers do, the thought process that we go through hiring. I mean, I used to say that we kissed 100 frogs to find 2 potential candidates. We might put those 2 through orientation, and we may not even hire them.
Right.
I mean, that's the scrutiny we have to undergo. I mean, for a company to be around 25 years, you guys to be around for 10 plus, that is really important.
Definitely, yeah. I wanted to touch on something you shared earlier, but regarding how we can afford to pay for the $35 million that can afford home care. But I don't know, Zach, did you have another comment?
Go for it.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on that if I can, Bob.
Sure, please do.
So there's some good momentum for our industry with regards to where we find the buckets of money to pay for in-home care. It's still a difficult road ahead, but there's some good news. So for listeners out there that may know folks 65 plus that can qualify for Medicare, there is momentum. Let me explain. CMS, which stands for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, in 2018 announced that health plans, for example, Anthem, that serves 65 plus population and is known as what's called the Medicare Advantage plan, those plans have the option to now include I know you don't like the term, Bob, but we're referred to non-medical home care. Those plans now have the option to fund home care as a benefit. Now, I said momentum. We're not there yet because groups like Anthem and others like throughout the country have started to do it. But as you know, Bob, Zach, you know, it's still very few here in 2019. In Arizona, there's an organization in Tucson, CareMore, who actually funds some of that care. They're an entity that's in partnership with Anthem. There may be others in Arizona. I'm not familiar, and forgive me if there are, and I'm not naming them.
No, but I'm so glad you brought this up. I mean, for me, more than anything, having been doing this for 25 years, even though that we're still in the infancy, the fact that CMS sees this as a need is a huge, monumental achievement. It really is, because, as you said before, the redheaded stepchild. We've been that redheaded stepchild, and we have not gotten that respect. We've not gotten that seat at the table. We're coming up on our last break here in the third segment, and then we'll start the fourth segment. But I want to pick up on MA plans because that is definitely a source to pay. I just don't know if they'll have the range that we'll need. But I really believe for transitionary care, it makes a lot of sense. You've been listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. I've got 24-hour home care in the studio. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. We're on our fourth segment. It's hard to believe. Time flies really fast. I have got two gentlemen here in the studio from 24-Hour Home Care. I've got Zac Morgan and Gavin Ward. And if you missed the first three segments, go up to our website at cypresshomecare.com. Click on the media button, third button down. It's the radio show. You'll catch those first three, and you'll catch this one as well. So let's jump right back into it. So we were talking about MA plans. So when we talk about MA, we use a lot of acronyms in healthcare. So we're talking about Medicare Advantage plans. And, that was a big, big deal, guys. Just the fact that CMS, they recognize the work that we do. It remains to be seen in terms of what the true dollars are going to be. 3%, according to AARP, of the Medicare Advantage plans took advantage of this. We know that number is going to grow. So we certainly have a seat at the table. And we were talking at the break that, they are limited in hours. I had heard as much as 120 hours. You have experienced 60. And it may even be less, but it's a benefit. And for me, I think the biggest deal is the biggest challenge we have for those older adults that are in an acute or post-acute setting is readmission. And the first 24, 48, 72 hours are critical. We haven't really talked about it here on the show today, but 1/3 of our population, 65 and older, lives home alone. And that's the area where we have the biggest challenge for frequent flyers, people to go back into the hospitals. The crazy thing is that in the next 11 years, a gentleman who runs the MIT Age Lab, Joseph Coughlin, predicts that the numbers will be close to 50% of 65-year-olds.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, no, definitely, Bob. Transitional care has kind of been the catalyst for getting home care's seat at the table. But like you've shared already in today's episode, folks need us more than just for a transition back home. Our hope in home care is to often wean ourselves out of a job, if you will. I don't know if that's the right phrasing, but that's not always the case.
Right.
So I talked about momentum earlier in the show. Medicaid actually provides ongoing care for individuals. I know you know this, and some of your listeners may know this. And one of the things that we're trying to do in our industry is, like you shared off the air, is how do we prove our value and have that empirical facts and data to support the ongoing care? I think it's coming. And it's our job to do it. And we've been fortunate. Zach and I have played a part in different programs with organizations. There's something called BPCI, which is also known as the Bundled Payment for Care Improvement Initiative by Medicare a few years back. And we've been fortunate to actually receive funding from at-risk health organization right here in Arizona. Zach's also led an initiative outside of here with a group called Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, doing some similar type of work as well with their at-risk population. So we're getting there. And some of these care authorizations, if you will, not necessarily through them, but we're starting to see lifelong authorizations. Department of Veteran Affairs, for example, sees the value, sees the savings. So there is some momentum, but like you shared, Bob, we're not there yet. But we are kind of leading the charge, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, I'll give a quick shout-out. You talk about Cedars-Sinai. My daughter, Jessica, just left yesterday to travel across the state, and she's living in Southern California. And on Monday, she reports to work. She's working at Cedars-Sinai. She's working in the cardiac failure unit as a new nurse graduate.
Oh,
Awesome.
Congratulations.
So we're excited in the Roth family.
Yeah.
Very, very excited.
Yeah.
But you know what's interesting? You talk about momentum. I've got a friend of mine that refers to as tailwind. We got a huge tailwind right now. And, the need is growing. And I can't emphasize enough some of the stuff we talked about off the air and you just brought up is we need the empirical data. We need the data to support the work that we do.
It is interesting. We've seen kind of two buckets, and I don't want to dive too deep into it because I know it gets a little bit in the weeds home care wise, but the data that we can collect as a home care agency is a lot different from the clinical data that, whether it be home health or a hospital or a SNF collects. And so we've seen kind of two different groups, whether it be, healthcare organizations or Medicare Advantage plans. There have been those that when they see the value of home care or the potential value of home care, because let's be honest, it is potential value. It's hard to put an exact number on either savings or certain outcomes. They say, we think this can work. Let's take a chance on it. Let's try it out. Let's be a little bit adventurous. Let's see if we can make this work. But I think what we have seen in, the 3% number you threw out just a little bit ago really speaks to this. More so, we've seen a lot of, since there's no data, I don't know if we can support this. But that creates kind of a catch-22 because how do you get the data unless you have the programs? So it'll be interesting to see. In 2020, they're untethering the medical requirement from some of those supplemental benefits in MA plans. So it'll be interesting to see if that grows at all. But I do want to emphasize, you talked about our name, 24-hour home care, and I think that's what people think about when they do think about home care is kind of those people that need the around-the-clock, the constant care, maybe the full overnight. But as I'm sure you see too, I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that actually most of our customers, the large majority, are in the 4 to 6 hour a day range. Mm-hmm. And so even if it's limited benefits, even if it's not around-the-clock care for some of those people with chronic conditions, more and more as people are staying in their homes longer and aging longer into life, even those amounts of impact, I think will start to show, I think there's a level of low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that can really be impacted with some sort of regular hours and financial help. So I am hopeful. You mentioned the tailwinds of that. I don't think it will be a kind of silver bullet anytime soon, but I do have hope for what it'll look like.
Well, I do too, and my family started this business at Cypress because we wanted to help families provide care, and our goal was to help family members by providing respite. And I gave that statistic about the fact that we have a third of our population 65 and older living home alone. There's not so much respite, at least not here in our state, and we're finding lots of people living alone. So the care sometimes can be intermittent for 4, 6, or 8 hours, but it goes by really, really fast, kind of like this show.
Yeah.
It goes by really, really fast. And, for us, the important fact is that the savings, and that's the empirical data that we need to get, is tremendous to keep people at home versus moving them into an assisted or skilled nursing facility. I want to give you guys an opportunity to give a shameless plug. How do you get a hold of 24-Hour Home Care? You guys do a podcast.
Yeah, so the 24-Hour Home Care website is 24HRcares with an S, so CARES.com.
You got locations in California, Arizona, and Texas, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. We're non-franchised, so we're privately owned, and we're happy to answer any questions. As you mentioned before, there's no shortage of us, but there is plenty of room for good companies to work together to provide the care that everybody needs.
We also host a show called pophealthpodcast.com. So if you want to stay up to date on the latest healthcare news and hear interviews from some of the Southwest's great healthcare leaders,
nice.
Feel free to take a listen, and it's found at www.pophealthpodcast.com or iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher. You can find it there as well.
Perfect. Hard to believe. Any lasting remarks or comments you want to leave our listeners as we say goodbye?
Yeah, I just think it's important, folks, as you're seeking care for a loved one, use a reputable home care company. If you see dollar signs that are a lot less somewhere, like Bob said earlier, do your investigation. There's a reason why those dollar signs are a lot less.
Ask for references, too.
Yeah. And for our professional colleagues, if you have the opportunity to put someone like Bob or Gavin or myself, who actually is an expert on the industry, in a position to start affecting change in places that home care was not included, maybe take that opportunity where you might not have before.
Fantastic. Well, I got to tell you, Gavin, great to have you on. Zach, amazing. I think we covered some great content here. I'd like to bring you guys back, so maybe we can do this in 2020. Make it a great day. Have a great weekend. We'll be back next Friday.
There's no place like home. You've been listening to Bob Roth's Health Futures. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call Cypress Home Care Solutions at 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Or visit CypressHomeCare.com. Be sure to join Health Futures with Bob Roth every Friday at noon, right here on Money Radio 1510 and 105.3 FM. This is the Money Radio Network.